We begin tonight with the Trump economy and his self-inflicted chaos. Trump today threatening Apple with a 25% tariff on all iPhones made outside the United States, even as experts agreed that an American-made iPhone would take time to figure out, and it would cost consumers thousands of dollars. Some estimates triple what an iPhone costs now. In a bizarre moment in the Oval Office today, Trump defended the proposed penalty against Apple, and moments later, his iPhone rang.
The iPhone, if they're going to sell it in America, I want it to be built in the United States. They're able to do that. We don't want to have Canada making our cars. We want to make our cars. Oh, it's a phone call. Do you mind? Hello?
Taking foreign students.
No. It's a different congressman. They're all congratulating us.
Last question, is it an iPhone, sir? The irony as Trump threatens to undermine a major American company. Trump also threatening the European Union with new sweeping 50% tariffs, one of America's top trading partners. The uncertainty rattling markets today, both the Dow and the S&P 500 sliding again, just the latest day of volatility caused by Trump's tariff announcements. And despite all that bluster, all the deals that are apparently being made, no major trade deals have been announced. So, in desperation, Trump is lashing out and making more and more threats. Wall Street titans like J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon are sounding the alarm.
You'll have stagflation. So I'm not saying it's going to happen. I don't want the reader to say he's predicting. I'm not. But we have to be prepared for something like that. I think the global fiscal deficits are inflationary.
All right, so Jamie Dimon warning about stagnating economic growth and inflation just as House Republicans passed their tax bill that would further enrich people like Dimon. Under the GOP plan, millionaires would pay $96 billion less in taxes. And how are Republicans planning to pay for those tax cuts? Deficits to start with, but also enormous cuts to the social safety net, $700 billion in cuts to Medicaid, $267 billion cuts from food assistance to the poorest Americans. 10 million people would lose their access to health care. In The Atlantic, Jonathan Chait calling this bill the, quote, largest upward transfer of wealth in American history, enriching the wealthiest people in the country at the expense of the neediest. This bill is so extreme that some Senate Republicans have vowed they can't support it in its current form. And when the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on the usually friendly Fox News, he was grilled about the impact of it.
You mentioned economic growth in your comment there. This bill adds trillions to our debt. How is that acceptable to this administration?
Well, again, you're referring to the CBO scoring, I believe, which is tenure scoring, and it's DC-style scoring. So we think that we can both grow the economy and control the debt. We can grow our way out of this.
We can grow our way out of this. Joining me now, Catherine Rampell, co-host of the Weekend Primetime, right here on MSNBC, and Washington Post columnist, and also Washington Post columnist, and Max Chafkin, co-host of Bloomberg's Everybody's Business podcast. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us. So, Catherine, it's not actually impossible to grow your way out of something in terms of the economy. That can happen when all the things are in the right place. There's so much business being done. People have wages. They're paying taxes. They're buying things, and the economy is actually growing. That's a working economy. Risky strategy. Well, Justin's talking about it like it's obvious. It's not obvious that's going to happen.
Every independent modeler of what this budget would do says it would not happen.
Right.
You will get some modest growth effects, at least in the beginning, but those will eventually be offset later on because of crowd-out effects. Basically, we take on a lot more debt. Interest rates go up. It makes it harder for private companies to get capital. So you will have... In the long run, actually, it may reduce our growth. But more to the point, this is so expensive.
Right.
This is so, this adds so much more debt that it's like virtually impossible to get the arithmetic to work out here.
So there are a whole bunch of things at play here, Max. There's the idea that it does add more debt, but there are lots of reasons to add debt, right? Sometimes it's a war. Sometimes you're expanding the size and scope of government. This is an unusual one because we're in a moment where, in fact, we are supposedly shrinking the size and scope of government, and yet we are expanding the debt as much as we are.
Yeah, it's really strange, especially listening to these Wall Street voices sort of coming to the conclusion that we're in a very uncertain period when only a few months ago they were kind of celebrating austerity. Remember all the talk of Doge? And there were people back then saying, hey, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, for them to get anywhere. Meanwhile, there is this tax bill waiting in the wings. We sort of knew this was coming, and now here it is. And the markets, of course, don't love it.
And so, Catherine, that's interesting. We knew it was coming, and yet we see these reactions in the market. The stock market is not a perfect measure, but it is definitely an active one. It's one where you can watch people's reactions. And I'm always fascinated the fact that on a given day or 2-day or 3-day period, investors will think something fantastic is happening, and then all of a sudden they'll move out of the markets. To Max's point, this is not less chaos than it was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or on Liberation Day. It's the same.
Well, what's interesting to me is that before Trump took office, there was a lot of kind of euphoria in the markets because the assumption was he would hand corporations tax cuts and not do the tariffs, right? Everybody kind of agreed, it seemed, that a 10% global tariff was beyond the pale, even though Trump promised it all the time. It was too crazy even for him to do.
Right.
Today, we're well beyond that, what was the worst case scenario. Right. We have not only 10% global tariffs, we have 30% tariffs on China, only 30%. We also potentially have 50% tariffs on the EU. We have a bunch of sector-specific tariffs as well, in autos and other things. And for some reason, the markets seem to have shaken it off.
Right.
And that part I don't entirely understand. Yeah. On top of all of the other reasons that, in my view, this president has made this country a less friendly place to do business by, for example, weaponizing the powers of the state against particular companies he doesn't like or particular CEOs he doesn't like. We saw that today with Apple, for example. So all of those things, to me, add up to a much worse economic outlook than had been forecast before Trump took office. And despite the slide in the markets today, it feels like the markets are still hoping that he's going to come to his senses and stop doing all of the really damaging things.
Catherine and I try and sort of figure out what the end game is here, and then reverse engineer it into saying, oh, I get why he's doing this. But there's no industrial policy end game here. There's no manufacturing policy end game. There's this talk about bringing all these factories back to America. I think people forget that our dreams about the 50s and the 60s and the factories that were here in the 70s, it's not how we would do it today if we had to redo it. We don't really want to be manufacturing socks in America.
I mean, there are a lot of issues going on. One is that it's not that American manufacturing has collapsed or something. It's just that American manufacturing as a job base has collapsed. There's still a ton of manufacturing in the United States. It just doesn't employ as many people. Even Apple, Apple does employ a lot of people in China, but if the factories that they have built, the operations they have built in the U.S. are not operations that employ huge numbers of people. I think the end game here, if Apple were to try to build an iPhone factory here, would take like 20 years and cost, like you said, a huge amount of money. I think the end game is to try to wring a little bit more investment out of Apple, the same way that Trump has been trying to wring things out of his European partners or various, governments or business leaders all around the world. It's all a negotiation. The problem is it's not clear that these negotiating partners are part of it, or they can give what he wants, or he's willing to accept what they're going to give him.
Or that any of it is strategic. So if we impose, for example, a 50% tariff on the EU, Trump seems to think that's only going to hurt the EU. Besides all of the effects on American consumers, that will actually hurt a lot of American manufacturers. Like Boeing gets a lot of its parts from Italy. Yeah,
Boeing actually bragged about the Dreamliner being an airliner that with parts from everywhere. Everybody can claim that it's their airline or their airplane. One of the other problems, Catherine, is that when we impose tariffs on people, they impose tariffs upon us. So in 2018, when we did this and China stopped buying our soy and a bunch of other things, we ended up subsidizing those farmers to the tune of close to $30 billion. A lot of those farmers thank Donald Trump for saving them from that situation. They missed part one, that we weren't in that situation until Donald Trump got us there. But the same thing's going to happen here. Once we settle on what our tariffs are for everybody, they'll do the same thing to us.
Yes, they have already done it, in fact, to us. I think Donald Trump is really good at setting a fire and then claiming credit for, finding the fire hose and dousing the flames. And we saw this back then in 2018, 2019, as you point out. But these tariffs are so much higher, and the potential retaliatory tariffs are so much more painful that, again, it's going to hurt not only American companies that purchase inputs, intermediate goods from abroad, like Boeing, as I was just mentioning, but a lot of companies that are themselves exporters that are going to be retaliated against.
Like Boeing, by the way. They are also an exporter.
Like Boeing, also like Boeing. They're a big exporter, in fact. And so, you know, given the scale of the damage here, there's only so much you can do to try to pay people off, a la the 2018 farmer bailout. It's not doable at this point.
Yeah, people will notice when it's a $280 billion bailout. Max, one of the things, whether you're talking about Boeing or Apple, is all the small businesses who have none of this leverage. There's no thumb on any scale. They are just trying to wonder whether their goods for back to school and ultimately for Christmas should be getting on a ship or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's disastrous for small business, particularly, you know, you think of kind of like a typical Shark Tank type business, somebody who's importing goods, you know, designing goods here, manufacturing in the U.S., sort of like, manufacturing in China, sort of like a miniature version of what Apple's doing. They can't move their supply chain around. Apple pulled all this inventory up. The reason why Apple's still doing well, why they haven't raised the price on the iPhone yet, is they imported a ton of iPhones before the deadline. That's not something a small company that doesn't have, you know, tens of billions of dollars in cash on hand can do. They can't shuffle around the supply chain to deal with India. I mean, I think they're really afraid right now, and they are like legitimately worried about the next year and about, you know, continuing to operate. A lot of companies.
I spoke to a woman last weekend who has taken out an SBA loan. Thankfully, she could get one to deal with her shipping issue and her tariff issue against her house. And still doesn't know what's going on. This is the reality of American small business. But, Catherine, I think it's lost on a lot of people that they are massive employers. Small businesses in America are big employers of people. And the first thing that goes when you're a struggling small business is your employees. You try and keep the place open yourself. But this is very damaging to our landscape if we hurt these small businesses.
Yeah.